Thank you, everyone who is attending today. Um, as this slideshow indicates, I'm going to discuss Marxism and disability rights. Um, and so, change. The first subject I want to bring up in my speech is what it means to be neurodiverse. Because the term neurodiversity is being used more prevalently. This is a very good thing because the concept of neurodiversity is crucial to achieving social justice for people who are autistic, people who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, Tourette syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia. These are all conditions that fall under the umbrella of neurodivergent. And the core concept of being neurodivergent is that when your neurology deviates from what is considered normal, that this isn't a problem that you need to fix, it is a problem that society needs to fix. What we challenge fundamentally is the concept of a normal brain. We argue that the mere notion that certain neurological types are quote unquote normal is a capitalist construct created for the purpose of helping corporations and others who benefit from the end stage capitalist status quo to continue with a system that allows them to literally profit, even though doing so is often at our own expense. Change. So, one of the ways that this is at our expense is that in order to thrive in a capitalist system, you have to mask. If you are neurodivergent and you possess certain traits, you are required to conceal who you are, those aspects of you that come naturally, for fear that doing so will literally hurt you economically. And I'm using the word literally in this on this occasion because people need to know that the stakes are truly that high for the neurodivergent community. It reminds me of why I chose the title Back Seat Socialism for my column. It's based on a 2009 comedy sketch by the group Whitest Kids You Know. And in it, the late comedian Trevor Moore says the only reason capitalism works is because it plays on man's biggest flaw, namely greed. And in terms of people who are disabled, in the ways that people who are neurodivergent are often classified as disabled, quote, masking increases anxiety by worrying about what other people think. It leads to perfectionist tendencies and low self-esteem. It's mentally exhausting to give so much energy to pretend to be someone you're not, and people often feel like imposters in their own lives, constantly afraid of people finding out about their ADHD. That's from the book Unapologetically ADHD by Nikki Kinzer and Pete D. Wright. And this is something that we need to remember as we critique capitalism, that the one of the main tolls that it takes on people who are neurodivergent is the emotional and mental health toll of constantly needing to mask change. Another concept that we need to accept is the fact that capitalism itself is informing this science, so to speak, about understanding neurodivergent neurology. So now I'm going to quote from the book Empire of Normality by the neurodivergent philosopher Robert Chapman, who currently teaches at Durham University. He says that in ancient Greece, health was understood as a form of harmony, such as through the philosopher Hippocrates, and it was also understood as such elsewhere in the world. This persisted until at least the 17th century. We then have to turn to the French philosopher René Descartes to see the broader shift in Enlightenment thinking about the body and health. For Descartes, the body was reconceptualized as a machine. In this view, health was no longer a matter of harmony, but rather a mechanistic matter of working properly. And that is, for instance, as we see on screen, more generally, the key limitation of existing neurodiversity theory and activism is that it is more focused on changing our thinking and attitudes rather than on changing material conditions. Chapman's observation here is key to the concept of neurosocialism, because while many who advocate for the neurodiverse community do so with the best intentions, when you do so without acknowledging how capitalism puts us at a permanent structural disadvantage, you miss a key component of both how we struggle and what solutions are needed to address our concerns. Um, and change. So, one one solution that I offer is the concept of radical acceptance, which I take again from Kinzer and Wright's book Unapologetically ADHD. They cite the famous scene in the movie Good Will Hunting, in which Robin Williams reassures Matt Damon's character, who, if not neurodivergent, is certainly coded as neurodivergent, for blaming himself for the abuse he suffered as a child, repeatedly saying it's not your fault. The underlying idea presented through that scene is that people who are neurodivergent, instead of internalizing the self-hatred that exists as a result of capitalism and one's struggles to compete in a capitalist society, should instead feel as if the way they are is okay, that they should accept what they cannot change about their neurology and instead fight for what they can change, namely broader social acceptance. To quote cognitive scientist Dr. Maureen Dunn in The Neurodiversity Edge, one in every five people you see each day may be living in a world defined by systematic and counterproductive exclusion from the opportunity to productively contribute to society. In terms of human capital potential, this is a devastating failure. Morally, it's a plague of injustice. And in her book, Autism is Not a Disease, the 23-year-old copywriter and journalist who is also autistic, Jodi Hare, writes, neurodivergent people and their families are being failed every day, and we will continue to fail them until we begin factoring in them into the creation of new systems. And in his book, We're Not Broken, Michael Garcia, a neurodivergent journalist and senior Washington correspondent at The Independent, said that autistic people are often the victims of what former President George W. Bush speechwriter Michael Gerson called the soft bigotry of low expectations, meaning they are expected to be unable to work or only able to work jobs that pay sub-minimum wage. And in case you need any proof that these accusations are correct, I refer to the recent quote by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., President Trump's chief health policy advisor, who refers to autism as an epidemic that needs to be cured and says that autistic people will never be able to pay taxes or hold a job, and some can't even wipe themselves. Change. So there is a lot of data reinforcing the observations I've made in a study that was released by the National Autistic Society in 2024. 2,449 autistic adults were surveyed, and through the survey, it was ascertained that they struggle massively and disproportionately with finding stable jobs or with even obtaining employment in the first place. They concluded that people who are on the autism spectrum are disproportionately likely to be unemployed or underemployed and to struggle to obtain work. In another study, 2024, released in the Journal of Attention Disorders, this one surveying 320 post-secondary students for ADHD symptoms, it found, quote, that inattention and hyperactivity impulsivity symptoms showed strong stability across the 15-year period. Additionally, inattention symptoms during emerging adulthood and early middle adulthood were consistently associated with poorer life success, that is, lower relationship and career satisfaction, particularly for men. Change. Now, the counter to this is the neurotypical argument that really we just need to find the neurodivergent people who are most capable of being productive. Individuals like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, who have been described as autistic, even though they have not made any such diagnosis public, reinforce this notion, and in fact, through their own public personas, especially Musk, try to claim that they are examples of autistic excellence and proof that autistic people thrive in capitalism. But in fact, through their actions, they reinforce neurotypical assumptions. They demand that autistic people define their ability to succeed within the narrow confines of what capitalists can profit from. And in so doing, regardless of whether they are in fact on the spectrum, which is highly debatable, they are deliberately reinforcing a status quo that disadvantages autistic people. To demonstrate this point, I'm quoting a famous essay by Eric Engdahl that parodies how neurotypical behavior would be described by neurodivergent people if neurotypicality was pathologized. In this quote, Eric Engdahl humorously writes, neurotypical syndrome is a neurobiological disorder characterized by preoccupation with social concerns, delusions of superiority, and obsession with conformity. Neurotypical individuals assume that their experience of the world is either the only one or the only correct one. NTs find it difficult to be alone. They are often intolerant of minor differences in others. When in groups, NTs are socially and behaviorally rigid and frequently insist upon the performance of dysfunctional, destructive, and even impossible rituals as a means of maintaining group identity. They find it difficult to communicate directly and have a much higher incidence of lying as compared to persons on the autism spectrum. And let me tell you, those traits all describe the so-called neurodivergent capitalists like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, as well as advocates of autism and capitalism like Peter Thiel. It is not a movement that advocates for our best interest. What is in our best interest is receiving a robust social safety network to provide us with monetary support when we need it and also to protect our rights. Change. To quote Jodi Hare from her book Autism is Not a Disease, when we trust neurodivergent people's accounts of their own lives and experiences, we can use this information to understand what more inclusive and useful research might look like. Instead of continuing the pursuit of possible causes and cures, a la RFK Jr., we have the opportunity to ask what research would be most beneficial for neurodivergent people. And to quote Dr. Dunn from the Neurodiversity Edge, the larger business world is badly lagging behind the curve in aligning organizational values with authentic neurodiversity inclusion, especially with respect to how that inclusion may represent a significant strategic asset in navigating the landscape of inevitable long-term transformational change ahead of us. In other words, we need to listen to neurodivergent people. We need to accommodate the needs as articulated by the neurodivergent community. And they're not asking to be pathologized. They're not asking to be cured. We want to be treated as equals in this society, to have our social justice rights protected, and to receive the same access to material benefits based on the quality of our work as the neurotypical community. Change. So this brings me to the most explicitly political point that I'm making. We need to support actual Marxist politicians, individuals who challenge the capitalist status quo by accurately diagnosing what it is that ails us, and not simply people who are centrist or moderately liberal or, as Chapman writes, neo-Thatcherist. Obviously, he's referring to the British Prime Minister from the 1980s who moved that country's politics to the right. But this observation applies to political movements everywhere in the world. So when he says the rise of neo-Thatcherism, you can substitute that phrase with MAGA or AfD in Germany or Likud in Israel or any other right-wing movement. The rise of neo-Thatcherism, whereby neurodiversity advocacy is turned into a business-oriented program for unearthing neurodivergent strengths or superpowers and then mining those with those strengths, may be useful for those neurodivergent people it helps into jobs. However, Chapman's observation is this does not work for the vast majority of neurodivergent people who, due to their lack of privilege, will still fundamentally be defined by the discrimination they face at the hands of neurotypical employers. Um, and so the important thing in that regard is to support politicians who advocate for increased welfare benefits to those who need it, who advocate for free health care, who advocate for strengthening the Americans with Disabilities Act to protect the rights of neurodivergent people who are classified as disabled when they face discrimination in employment or in education or elsewhere in life. Change. Another concept that I want to embrace, and this is something I recently wrote about for the journal Nonprofit Quarterly, which it advocates for social justice causes for nonprofits and activist organizations. In that article, I spoke with former Social Security Commissioner Martin O'Malley, and he described how under President Trump, the law is being casually broken in order to persecute immigrants right now, but eventually we assume to persecute other people. Autistic individuals, including myself, are concerned that the talk of a registry and of cracking down on our community in general puts us in danger. And so, one of the things that O'Malley and I urge for immigrants who face discrimination, but I would extend this to everyone who is facing Trump's lawlessness, including possibly neurodivergent individuals, that they do have rights. They can advocate that state and local law enforcement fight for them, that if people who work for Trump break the law in order to advance his agenda, they can be charged with crimes. To quote O'Malley from Nonprofit Quarterly, I would strongly encourage attorneys general and local states attorneys to file kidnapping charges against those who would kidnap people in our country in violation of every principle of due process and habeas corpus that has applied here ever since our independence from Britain. This argument, I can't stress enough, does not only apply to people who are persecuted for being immigrants. It applies to anyone who is legitimately wronged, whose legal rights are violated by this administration. The Supreme Court may have provided Trump with a carte blanche in terms of receiving immunity from prosecution due to him being president, but that protection does not extend to his goons. They can be stopped. And this is something that we should all be mindful of as we protect our rights in the United States. Um, Change.
Matthew, 4 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much. I have about 4 minutes left, so very convenient. Um, I am writing a book called Neurosocialism, which, as Professor Wainwright very kindly said, is going to be published by Beacon Press probably in 2027. And I am going to soon have a Substack at Democracy at Work called Back Seat Socialism, which advocates for a socialist approach to all political subjects, not just neurodiversity rights. In conclusion, what I would say is this. We are currently at a crucible in human history. There are far-right movements taking power from the United States and Hungary to Russia and Israel. We need to fight this war against them on many different fronts. But on top of that, as income inequality gets worse, as climate change gets worse, as plastic pollution and other forms of ecocide get worse, as white supremacy and patriarchy and other forms of systemic discrimination get worse, the need to address the root cause, which is end stage capitalism and the way it privileges the few over the many, must be fundamentally addressed. I do not claim that neurodivergent people are the only victims of end stage capitalism. I don't even claim that we are the primary victims of end stage capitalism. What I do point out is that we are victimized by end stage capitalism in a very unique way, and the solutions for our problems in end stage capitalism must be addressed. I would also point out that regardless of whether one believes neurodivergent people have superpowers, to quote Greta Thunberg, or whether it should simply be viewed as an innocuous neurological difference, the reality is our perspective on the world is distinct, and therefore our critiques of capitalism can be uniquely valuable. So, in conclusion, I urge all people in the neurodivergent community to mobilize behind left-wing candidates and causes, to depathologize neurodiversity in casual conversation and in greater public discourse, and to not allow far right wingers like Elon Musk to define how autism is viewed to the rest of the world. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.